we can go on with the seminar. And I would like to introduce this seminar. This seminar, the aim is to reach the students and to present part of the results of the BET-COSL project, and also to discuss about the two important legal system, the legal system of Belgium and Germany, that we analyze in the BET-COSL project. Before to start with the presentation, Professor Alexander Tebega and Dr. Eva Rulans, I would like to introduce Professor Sandulli, the coordinator of the BET-COSL project, and give the floor to Professor Sandulli to introduce the research of BET-COSL project. Please, Professor.
Thank you very much, Alessandro, and thank you, dear colleagues. It is a great pleasure to take part in this second BET-COSL project seminar. I just remember that the first was held a couple of weeks ago in Poland, and the third will be held in Italy next month. First of all, I would like to thank our colleagues from Ghent University, especially Professor Alexander de Becker. Ghent University, in the same ways as Nicolaus Copernicus University in Torun, is a core partner in this project, and it is a partnership we aim to strengthen for the future. Let me just say some words, a couple of things about the BET-COSL project funded by the European Union Hercule III program. First of all, BET-COSL is an acronym for a better knowledge for better solution, and we are trying to know and understand better how the organization and procedures in the different European nations work in order to find solutions, and in particular to protect the EU's financial interests and fight against frauds. What are the main contents of the project, and why is the protection of the EU's financial interests so important for our legal orders? I think that the protection of the EU's financial interests has become a very important issue, especially in the times we are living. It is important for the future of our supranational legal order. It is enough to think of growing link with the rule of law and with the general principle of European law. And it is important also for economic reasons, because with the recovery fund we have now a great opportunity. A few words about the project. Our project is divided into 4 parts. The first 2 parts of the project were dedicated to monitoring the current situation from the point of view of European comparative law. We analyzed 4 countries: Belgium, Germany, Italy, and Poland. We studied in particular criminal and administrative law issues. We have already completed this part of the project, and you can find the first 2 deliverables published in our website. At the moment, we are working on the third part of the project, and it is an empirical research in the 4 countries I mentioned before. And we are conducting interviews both with the European and national institutions, and we are also submitting surveys to students of law faculties from the 4 countries. And the last part of the project aims to provide some guidelines to improve the detection of fraud and irregularities. For example, one of the aims is to suggest how to shape procedures under the new multi-annual financial framework, ex ante or in itinere, and also how to prevent frauds specifically in the social sectors. Moreover, the project aims to foster the development of specific legal tools in the field of financial protection from a comparative perspective. In this way, the project will try to answer some key questions. Are the European and current national tools sufficient? Is the interplay between them well balanced, or they need to be improved? Also, considering that the EU has supporting competences in those sector now under stress with the pandemic in the pandemic, and they will receive a large amount of money over the coming years. For all these reasons, our research is very intense and demanding, and it is hoped that it can produce useful results in order to implement the European integration process. And I hope that useful elements can come out already in this seminar on Belgium and Germany. Thank you very much.
Sorry, thank you, Professor, to introduce the BETCOSOL project. Now I introduce the first presentation of the day, and the Professor Alexander de Becker. Professor Alexander de Becker is a professor of labor law and social law at the University of Ghent and co-founder of research center LISA. Professor Alexander de Becker is part of the BETCOSOL project. In particular, he analyzed the case studies of Belgium and Germany. Now I would like to give the floor to Professor de Becker for the presentation. Thank you, Alexander.
Thank you, Alexander, and also thank you to my colleague Alexander for the very kind words and the kind introduction. I'm really convinced that the root and that something which will come out of the results of the students in interviews with students answers to the questions which we face now, that fundamental research and definitely knowledge of the existing system is something we still need to work on, and where good indications have to be given. I'll try to join my PowerPoint to the extent that you're able to see now. Are you all able to see it?
Yes. Yes, Alexander.
Okay, thank you, Alexander. As said, it's an honor. It's also an honor that Eva Ruans joined us to take care of a large part of Germany, because there was a major issue, and she really does it very well. And I want to stress it before she starts her explanation. We got out of the Belgian results with regard to the student quarter, we got 82 results. I just give an indication, it's still in Dutch, there's an indication how we did it. We have a QR code for which I want to thank Lovic Klaus involved in taking care of this element and ask the students during the course, during the breaks to put it in, which led us to 82 results, 82 respondents. Obviously, they're students, so their age is rather young, between 18 and 20 is what it should be. We have 26 respondents. The majority of them is obviously between 21 and 25, which is the typical student age, as you can imagine. We didn't have any in the late 20s, between 26 and 30, over 30 apparently. We've got one long lasting student or somebody who has already set up a professional career and still participated in this inquiry, in this research inquiry. So to that extent, we were quite happy with respondents. And what came actually out of the inquiry, out of the student inquiry, which we brought up in Belgium, the major element is the knowledge of European funds and definitely European financial criteria is rather limited. And also you see that to the extent that they do know it, because it's a hard one for them, 87% of them indicates that they're not aware of the fact that they have benefited from European funds, which is pretty clear because it might be that in an indirect way by supporting some other elements like regional works, which very often happens somewhere in the Walloon region or in the Flemish region, that they did have some beneficial from it, but without fully knowing it. So direct beneficial from European funds, 87% says no, 13% says yes, and the large majority it's not a big surprise. The Erasmus Plus project, and I think the 10% scholarship might also be included in similar way as an Erasmus Plus project. The 10 other percent, which is in fact, which are a very limited number of 3 persons, enjoyed, and I hope they really enjoyed it, the free train tickets, which were given during the COVID pandemic in order to visit Europe. We see that all those answers, yes answers, so the 13% were within range 21-25, with only one exception, apparently with a very early Erasmus Plus beneficiary who got, as an exchange student, the opportunity to do it before he or she attained the age of 20. When it concerns whether a nation, Belgium as a whole, and all its sub-state entities, because we've got quite a lot of them for a small country, have got any own financial interests. I was a bit surprised the fact that only 72% of the law students in the Netherlands answered yes, and 28% answered no. It seems rather obvious when it's linked to legal issues that national financial interests are linked to the exercise of authority and to the exercise of governance as a whole. Apparently, I don't know what they exactly mean, because obviously that's too hard to judge from a distance. But we do see that 28% still considers that there is no such a thing, such a mention as national financial interest. Surprisingly or not surprisingly, the answer, if yes, are they worthy of protection? 85% indicate that were to be protected our national financial interests, while 15% indicates no. It's a bit bizarre that one student consider that it exists, that's not worth to be protected, and another, and that's even more peculiar, considers it does not exist any national financial interest, it's never was worth to be protected, which is quite difficult to put together. But anyhow, you do see, on the other hand, that there is a large majority who are aware of the fact that a nation, and there is more in a nation than just the state itself, has national financial interest. With regard to the EU financial interest, it's a bit strange at first sight. You see that 82 to 83% and answers yes to the questions whether the EU has any financial interest, which is a lot higher than with regard to national financial interests. So obviously we've got 82 respondents, which is not an enormous crowd of people, but still it's significant enough to see that there is a 10% distinction between national financial interests as being known and being recognized as an important issue. And EU financial interest, and at least for me, surprisingly, the recognition of EU financial interests lies higher than the recognition of national financial interests. Obviously, whether they were to be protected, actually they're on level or almost on level, because it's 82% who indicated that the EU has financial interests, and 82.9% who indicated when they have got it, it's worth to be protected. So you indicate that it's almost the same percentage actually considers that it exists and it's worth to be protected, while the same percentage, 6% until 17.1% indicates that there is no real interest in with regard to financial needs, and therefore it's not should be protected. So it's still, when you look at both results, I mean, it's a bit surprising that the EU result with regard to financial interest is a lot higher, but you still see that there is a considerable minority, not a big one, but a considerable one, indicating that they are not aware of any financial interest, no condemnation, no thing. When there are EU financial interests, that was the next question, there is 90.4% which are considering that it's worth that EU institutions are protecting. Even further than that, they indicate that EU institutions are in place and are competent to take care of the protection of those EU financial interests, while 9.6% indicate that there is no control through EU institutions of the financial interests of the EU, which is once again a bit of a bizarre result, because we see that 82 to 83% first states that there is financial interest, while 90% all of a sudden, so 7 to 8% more indicates that EU institutions actually protect those financial interests. We shouldn't overestimate the importance of it, because there is sometimes a small difference in the number of respondents replying to question or answering to a question that's better. Replying to a question, so it might also lead to small number, actual difference in numbers replying to the question, but still we see that there is a rise as we go further with the queries. So it might be good that only the elements that there were queries and that there was a questionnaire to be answered, that it made more and more students aware of the importance of protection of financial interest. If you look at which institutions actually have to deal with it, we see this very fragmented. We see that most of them believe that it's for the ECB, so the European Central Bank, to take care of EU institutions and the financial interests of the EU, which is not exactly, obviously, with regard to the Troika, it might have rendered the most exposure. So to that extent, I understand what they mean. But obviously, the pure protection and the knowledge of other institutions apparently lacks a bit behind. Although, and I was pretty surprised myself, that the second coming out of the questionnaire is already Olaf Apple, which means that they are 23% of them, at least, that they are aware that there is specific institution taking care of fraud and taking care of violations of EU financial interests. So it means that it's not a high number. We still have quite some work to do, but still it means that there is a growing awareness of the existence of OLAF, because it ends up to be ranked as second, while the European Parliament and even the European Court of Justice score a lot lower than they do, which is a bit surprising according to me. The European Court of Justice scores only 8.7% for two reasons. First of all, it concerns really low students. Secondly, because of the fact that the European Court of Justice, in the end, always has the possibility and even the obligation to render decisions when it really comes out to more difficult elements. So the legal reasoning behind it seems to be undisclosed in a better way in the future to a larger public. When you ask them what the financial interests of the EU are, they obviously indicate that revenue, expenses, and assets covered or due from the EU budget and budgets of the EU institutions are the most important things. To the overlap between revenue and with revenue, expenses, and assets covered or acquired and owned by the EU member states, or covered or acquired or owned by EU citizens, is not fully where they really link it to the institutions as being individual entity, which to a certain extent obviously is a consequence of the choice which they had. They had to take one of the two, so I understand why the majority indicated that one. Secondly, also they really see the EU budget and budget of these EU institutions as something separately, apparently, from assets, expenses, and revenues acquired or owned by EU member states. So the link between them has not been fully indicated, although one should underline and one should see that the number of students indicating they also include revenue, expenses, and assets covered or acquired or owned by EU member states, which might be linked to revenue and expenses and assets which are received entirely or partially through the EU, and the revenue, expenses, and assets covered or acquired or owned by EU citizens, still has a significant number of positive responses. So to that extent, I do think that they see the complexity of the picture, because it's not just that they link it to one specific topic and to one specific issue. And that's for me personally one of the most surprising elements. Second part of this. First, the protection to avoid widespread EU financial fraud. How is it organized in your member state? Is there a good system which is set up? And the answer is that's fair in a large majority, 59.8%. It's good, almost 20%, insufficient, 17%, and compared with 3.7%. So there is an indication that might be linked to the elements that we are not aware, or there is not a lot of publicity granted to potential or real abuse of EU financial means in Belgium. So we don't have a lot of cases where it's spread out and where it's made public that there might be issues with EU means or EU financial means which are granted to the member states or within the EU itself, which are abused. The second element, they state that 72% of Belgium is committed to avoid widespread EU financial fraud, while 26%, 26.8 indicated that Belgium is not committed. It's a high level of awareness, although with regard to Belgium, it might be a bit surprising to the extent that obviously when there are real issues, when there are real problems, our Belgian tribunals and our Belgian public authorities has to deal with it, and public prosecutors have to deal with it, because obviously mainly they might take in Brussels. It might take place in Brussels when it's really linked to the core business, to the heart of the finance of the EU itself. So to that element, I was a bit surprised, even if it's a large majority who's aware of the fact that the growth of Belgium seems to be big, but still the fact that the EU is actually, or the capital of the EU, and a lot of EU institutions, not all of them, but a lot of EU institutions are localized in Belgium, doesn't lead to an overwhelming majority, still a large one, but an overwhelming majority. Then the final element of the results, and then I'll start to explain something more on some more issues we have to take care of for further research, which I've been thinking of for further research, is that with regard to education, the elements of EU financial interests are not very often taken into account. We see that in high school, only 20% of the respondents indicate that they were made aware of the fact that something like EU financial interests actually exists. That's a low number, and perhaps we should take into account that given the growing role of the EU, given the growing impact of EU institutions, students perhaps, or even pupils perhaps, need to be need to get into contact with such issues, with such topics. Then you see that most of their information comes from social media, which is obviously linked to the element that perhaps they might get a lot of their information from social media, but not only therefore you see that with regards to journalists, to news brought up, social media plays an important role. So EU financial issues, when they're brought up, it will be very often brought to the students through social media, and even the most often, but still it remains a rather low number of students indicating that EU financial interest was brought to their attention by social media, only 36.6%. So it means that even the coverage through journalists or through other possible information passed by social media remains limited. And also, and that's perhaps a big task also for politicians, is that only 23% apparently are talking about the EU financial interests and the impact of the EU financial interests on policies, politics in general, and so also the interplay between the member state and different EU financial interests remains apparently limited, which is a bit surprising on one hand, once again, because European Parliament, which is the heart of European politics, in combination with European Commission, they're both localized in Brussels. So it's the heart from where actually the information of all those politicians should start, and apparently it's not picked up, or not in a large manner picked up by students, indicating when and who might be of any interest for them. They actually seem to focus more on local politicians, and therefore I mean national politicians, indicating at certain moments that there is some financial pressure on the member states with regard to EU financial interests which have to be served. One student just puts the name of Guy Verhofstadt without any further explanation, indicating that he was the only man who brought up EU financial interests in this context. Those are the results of the questionnaire and of reactions of our students. I think when you look at it, I think we still have quite some work to do to make students or younger people in general, perhaps, because aware of the fact that the EU actually plays an important financial role in our continent and in supporting member states. I would have guessed that with regard to the COVID pandemic and all the support which has been granted by the EU during the COVID pandemic, we would have spread wider the message of support to the EU and as a consequence, potential abuse of EU financial means. It doesn't come out, according to me, perhaps you might disagree on it, out of this questionnaire and the responses to it. So I think we still have quite some work on that level. Secondly, I think we still have quite some work to see at national and at EU level that EU financial interests play a key role in our daily policies at EU level. However, I must also stress that it's important that our journalists are currently, I don't know whether it is because we don't have cases, but they don't pay a lot of attention to potential abuse of EU financial means in Belgium at this stage. I think, and that's something I wanted to add, but I'm going to limit my time because Eva should have the possibility to present what she has prepared. I think it's an important element also that everything which has to do with whistleblowers needs to be stressed, that we are actually working out possibilities for whistleblowers as well at public within public authorities as in private levels under pressure of the EU directive, obviously, and then that should help also to bring up more awareness of EU financial interests within authorities themselves when financial means are granted to member states, to sub-state entities in the member states, or, and that's the last one, obviously, directly to private companies, such a whistleblower regulation, which we're currently preparing, might help to overcome or to make the awareness wider than it is for the moment. I propose to stop here and then I'm open for any questions later.
Thank you, Alexander, for this interesting presentation of the first results of the interview, the quantitative interview for the Belgian students. And I would like to introduce for the debate Eva Roelands. Dr. Eva Roelands is a postdoctoral research in University of Cologne and is a leading expert on labor law and criminal fraud. And we are happy to introduce Eva and the presentation. And also I give the floor to Eva for the presentation.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Looks good. Perfect. The topic of my presentation is Introduction to German Criminal Fraud Law and its application in the Corona pandemic. When we talk about fraud in Germany, we are talking about a series of offenses that the legislator has created around the core offense of Section 263 of the German Criminal Code. For example, the German Criminal Code not only has a special provision for subsidy fraud, the law also regulates computer fraud, investment fraud, sports betting fraud, and insurance fraud. In context of the pandemic, ordinary fraud and subsidy fraud have become practically relevant. I have brought you the examination schemes of both offenses, but don't worry, we will discuss the characteristics and the differences of both offenses in detail later on. Since normal fraud under Section 263 of the Criminal Code is the basic offense, I would like to start with a brief introduction to this before subsequently making references to the pandemic and also discussing subsidy fraud. In doing so, my presentation is in light of the fact that the offense of fraud is one of the most complicated and controversial norms in German criminal law. There is disagreement on every element of the offense. Overall, a widely differentiated dogmatics has developed to make the norm applicable in practice. So we can already state fraud is hard fair. However, I will try to give you an overview of the essence of fraud in this lecture. First of all, fraud is part of German criminal core law, which means that it is regulated in the German criminal code. Legally protected are assets. In Germany, at least still, the so-called legal interest doctrine prevails, which means that every criminal offense must protect at least one legal interest. In order to be convicted of fraud, a serious number of constituent elements of the offense must be fulfilled. So let us start with the objective elements of the offense, and here with the criminal conduct deception. We are therefore on the left side of the examination scheme, and here at the first point of the objective facts. According to the legal text, deception can lie in the pretense of false facts or in the distortion or suppression of true facts. These three modalities cannot be exactly delimited and partly overlap. Pretense means that the presentation of a non-existent fact as existing. Distortion of true facts means the falsification of an actual overall picture by adding or omitting essential circumstances. And finally, suppressing true facts means preventing the knowledge of a fact. Overall, the act of fraud can therefore be summarized as deception about facts. It is important that in any case, a communicative relationship is established between the offender and the victim, which in all cases refer to facts. Our demarcation must be made between this and value judgments. That means opinions, which can be difficult in certain cases. What makes subsumption even more difficult is that German criminal law on fraud recognizes three forms of deception, namely explicit deception, so-called implied deception, and deception by omission. While the offender communicates openly in the case of explicit deception, implied deception comes into consideration if the offender's overall behavior is to be understood as a tacit declaration of a fact according to the general view. The greatest difficulty lies in determining the implied declaratory value of conduct. In Germany, here the risk concept has increasingly prevailed. This means that it is asked whether legitimate interests of the victim are affected because the offender creates risks for the victim's assets with his conduct. In practice, numerous case groups are used here, which are, however, also highly controversial in detail. As far as deception by omission is concerned, this is only possible if the offender has a special close relationship to the third party's assets because he is responsible for its protection and supervision. If, according to all this, deception can be proven, then this must lead to an error on the part of the deceived. This is the second requirement of the objective facts. An error exists when there is a misconception about facts. It is important that only humans can err, so we need a human communication partner. Therefore, if the offender manipulates automatic processes on the internet, as it is increasingly the case, the offense of computer fraud, which is regulated in section 263A of the Criminal Code, applies. Situations in which the victim has doubt can be problematic, and this is not surprising in view of the sometimes grotesque fraud practices. Here, however, the case law is basically victim-friendly, which means that the victim does not lose protection under criminal law already if he or she doubts the truth of the offender's statements. In addition to deception and error, the objective elements of the offense require that the offender makes a so-called disposition of property. This is an unwritten element of the offense. It was read into the facts of fraud as standard in order to distinguish fraud from theft. According to German law, fraud is a so-called self-harm offense, which means that the victim must harm himself. Theft, on the other hand, is a so-called external damage offense, which means that the offender intervenes in the sphere of the victim from the outside and takes property away from him. And the disposition of property now makes it possible to distinguish between fraud and theft. Disposition of property is defined as a voluntary action, tolerate, or omission which has a direct effect on the reduction of assets. This will regularly be the payment of a sum of money or the transfer of possession of a thing. However, a disposition of property can also be the conclusion of a contract, since in this case the property is loaded with the claim of the contractual partner and is accordingly reduced by this claim. The disposition of property must then lead directly to a pecuniary loss for the victim. We have thus arrived at the fourth point of the objective facts. Whereas in the case of disposition of property, it is examined whether the conduct of the deceived party has led to reduction in assets. In the case of pecuniary loss, it is now examined whether this reduction in assets has actually remained. Whether pecuniary loss exists is therefore to be determined by comparing the assets before the disposition and after the disposition by way of an overall balancing. A pecuniary loss exists if the reduction in assets has not been directly compensated by an equivalent increase in assets. However, if the victim, for example, simply obtained a bad price for a good, this is not sufficient for the assumption of pecuniary loss, because under criminal law, the freedom of disposal is only protected against fraud and threat, but not against deception. The determination of pecuniary loss can be extremely difficult in individual cases, and this is also due to the legal concept of the so-called damage-like endangerment of assets. In order to affirm a pecuniary loss, the reduction in assets does not necessarily have to be realized economically. Rather, it is sufficient that the assets are already so concretely endangered that, from an economic point of view, a deterioration of assets has already occurred. So, in the end, we only need a concrete endangerment of assets for a completed fraud. This is the case if the realization of the damage is obvious and the danger of its occurrence is great. The threat to assets thus differs from the pecuniary loss only in a quantitative, but not in a qualitative way. However, this legal concept now comes into conflict with constitutional law. For their Article 103, paragraph 2 of the Basic Law regulates this so-called principle of certainty, which stipulates that an act can only be punished if the punishability was determined by law before the act was committed. The Federal Constitutional Court therefore requires that the endangering damage must be quantified in detail, which means in practice that the courts generally cannot do without an expert witness. With pecuniary loss, we now have dealt with all objective elements of the offense. Finally, here is a special feature that you may have already noticed. We need a connection between all elements of the offense, which means that the error must be based on the deception, the disposition of property on the error, and the pecuniary loss on the disposition of property. If we now take a look at the subjective elements of the offense, we are dealing with a rather complex four-step examination. First of all, however, it is important to emphasize that fraud is an intentional offense. German criminal law therefore does not punish anyone who damages the assets of another through negligent deception. And what is more, there must even be a special intention, the so-called intention to enrich. But how is the subjective element of the offense examined in detail? For this, the offender must first show intent with regard to all of the objective elements of the offense, so all the features we have just discussed. In German criminal law, intent means knowledge and will. However, it is sufficient that the offender shows either knowledge or will, and it is even sufficient if he acts with so-called dolus eventualis, which means that he only considers the realization of the offense to be possible. If we can establish this, the second step is to determine the intention that the offender wanted to enrich himself or third party. In case of intention, the intent element is dominant. The offender must therefore be interested in obtaining the pecuniary advantage. In addition, this advantage must also be objectively unlawful, and the offender must have an intention in this respect. So only those who do not have a legally justified claim to the advantage they are seeking are liable to prosecution for fraud. Finally, the fourth step of the examination relates to the so-called substance equality. This means that the advantage aspired by the offender must be based on the same disposition of property as the pecuniary loss suffered by the victim. And if we can affirm this, we have examined all specific elements of the offense of fraud, and the court can convict the offender of fraud if he has acted illegally and guilty overall. That was a quick ride through a very, very complex offense under German criminal law, on which there is so much literature that entire libraries could be filled. So take a breath before we take a closer look at subsidy fraud. To begin with, perhaps a few criminological data. The clear up rate in the area of fraud is relatively high in Germany at about 74%. However, it is assumed that the number on unreported cases is high because particularly sophisticated crimes usually remain undetected. The internet poses particular dangers here, as the latest evaluations indicate that the large majority of crimes are under the influence of the internet. In 2020, 73% of the offenses committed with the internet were fraud offenses. And this could also be seen during the pandemic, where numerous new forms of fraud developed in which the internet played a major role. Here, criminals exploited the fear for the coronavirus in many, many ways. For example, fake shops offered and sold medical equipment and respirators that were never delivered to the customers. All the offenders posed as infected related in order to obtain money from their victims. This is a variation of the so-called grandchildren's trick, which is very popular in Germany. Another variant, the offenders posed as public officials and asked people at the front door to take tests for COVID-19 virus. And more recently, fraudsters have been offering corona vaccines from well-known manufacturers over the phone. These criminal behaviors mainly affect older people and singles. In addition to all this, a so-called corona card is currently circulating, which is supposed to indicate in real time where corona infections have been registered. This card is used by criminals as an attractant. If the card is opened, malware reads passwords and accesses data on the computer. All these behaviors damages assets of individual citizens. The relevant offense here is fraud under section 263 of the Criminal Code, which we have just discussed. However, there have also been fraud practices that affect the financial interests of the Federal Republic of Germany and also the European Union. This concerns cases in which the offenders unjustly benefit from state subsidies. During the pandemic, the German federal government provided bridging aid for businesses and self-employed. Thus, small and medium-sized enterprises that had to suspend or severely restrict their business operations during the pandemic were able to receive comprehensive subsidies as bridging aid. Furthermore, solo self-employed persons and freelancers could apply for financial support. The subsidy served to cover the loss of turnover as well as operating expenses such as rent or leasing. In addition, businesses received a large portion of salary and incidental expenses for employees who were put on so-called short-time work. Short-time work is a labor law mechanism that allows for a reduction in working hours in the event of a significant shortfall in the demand for labor. In this case, workers receive less pay, but this is partially compensated by a state benefit from social insurance called short-time allowance. Finally, there were a large number of nationwide assistance programs during the pandemic, which supported families and the socially vulnerable in particular. Criminogenic structures, however, have occurred primarily in the area of business promotion and support for the self-employed. For example, many applicants made false statements when applying or applied for subsidies in the name of actual existing companies or self-employed persons without their knowledge. Others applied for subsidy for a bankrupt company, but had the subsidies paid out to another account. And still others have claimed fictional employees who did not exist in reality. Finally, Corona emergency aid was used for private purposes. This abuse was encouraged by the fact that this aid was paid out relatively unbureaucratically and without any verification. In fact, all that had to be done was to fill out an application on the internet. Under criminal law, conduct in connection with the granting of subsidies leads to the special offense of subsidy fraud, already mentioned, which is regulated in section 264 of the German Criminal Code. The law explicitly includes benefits from public funds under the law of the European Communities, which is why the offense also protects the financial interest of the European Union. On the 31st day of December 2020, about 14,000 criminal proceedings had already been initiated for subsidy fraud in connection with Corona emergency aid for the self-employed and small businesses. In total, this is said to have resulted in damages of more than 150 million euros. These are enormous numbers, considering that this aid has only been paid out since the middle of last year, and not all grants have been audited yet. The high number of criminal proceedings is probably also due to the fact that subsidy fraud has less strict requirements than normal fraud. And this brings us back to our initial scheme. First of all, subsidy fraud is a so-called abstract endangerment offense. The norm therefore presupposes neither an error nor the occurrence of a pecuniary loss. The offense is rather completed with the deception, which means that the criminal liability is shifted in the apron of actual fraud. You can see the important differences to normal fraud in the examination scheme, where I have highlighted them in red. Now to the requirements in detail. The offender is liable to prosecution for subsidy fraud if, in the course of the approval procedure, he makes incorrect or incomplete statements about subsidy-relevant facts that are advantageous to him or a third party. In addition, the improper use of subsidies or the hide of facts relevant to the subsidy can also be considered a suitable offense. And facts are relevant to the subsidy if they have been designated as such by law or on the basis of a law by the provider of the subsidy. Likewise, if the law or the subsidy provider has made the approval, granting, continued granting, or repayment of the subsidy dependent on these facts. In this case, however, he must be able to refer to a law relevant to the granting of the subsidy. So you can see that the subsidy provider has a decisive influence on the scope of criminal law in the event that neither the subsidy agreement nor the law designate the fact as relevant to the subsidy. If in this case the subsidy provider does not designate the fact as relevant to the subsidy, section 264 of the Criminal Code is not applicable. In the Corona pandemic, this risk of a criminal liability gap did not materialize. On the contrary, in the Corona application, there is often a blanket indication that all information is subsidy relevant, which has greatly expanded the scope of subsidy fraud here. In the pandemic in particular, inaccurate statements were made in the application procedure about the economic situation, threatening the existence of the company, which was made a requirement for the payout of funds by the legislature. According to the subjective elements of crime, it is important to recognize that subsidy fraud does not require intent, which means that the offender does not have to know whether what he is stating is correct, nor does he have to want to deceive. Rather, reckless action is sufficient. Recklessness is an increased form of negligence, and it is characterized by particular indifference or rough carelessness. This also includes cases in which the offender does not check the information in detail due to mindlessness. However, subsidy fraud provides the offender with a golden bridge back to legality. This is the point on the Roman 4 in the examination scheme. It means that the offender can resign from the offense with exemption from punishment if he prevents the subsidy from being granted, for example, by withdrawing his application. If the subsidy is granted, then he remains exempt from punishment even if he makes a serious effort to prevent its payment. Nevertheless, it is overall much easier to be prosecuted for subsidy fraud than for normal fraud. This brings me to the end of my overview of the offense of subsidy fraud. Since this is a seminar in which the focus is on the financial interest of the European Union, you are surely now asking yourself when these will also receive separate treatment in this presentation. The answer to this is clear: not at all, because German law does not provide for separate treatment of the financial interest of the European Union, neither in the law nor in criminal proceedings. First of all, this concerns to substantive law. Here, the financial interests of the European Union are protected via the general criminal offenses of the Criminal Code, in particular normal fraud and subsidy fraud, in section 263 and 264. In both cases, the law only provides for a higher penalty for offenders who abuse their position as European officials. In this case, there is a so-called special case of fraud or subsidy fraud. The EU's financial interests are not treated separately in criminal proceedings either. This applies above all to pretrial proceedings because, as a rule, the public prosecutor's office does not know the origin of the funds that are subject of the offense. In addition, the power norms of the Code of Criminal Procedure do not distinguish between the financial interest of the Federal Republic of Germany and the financial interest of the European Union. Thus, we can draw a conclusion at the end of this lecture. The protection of the EU's financial interest in Germany is only as good as the overall state of criminal law and its practical implementation. And here we can look with some optimism and on German criminal law on fraud. It might be true that the core offense of section 263 of the Criminal Code is disputed in many places. However, new forms of fraud can also be solved for the most part with the jurisdictions, case groups, and the widely differentiated fraud dogmatics. I hope that this presentation has given you an impression of German criminal fraud law and its application in the corona pandemic. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you so much for this interesting presentation. I take some notes and I have questions for you and for Alexander. But I would like to know if before our colleague have questions, or I can start with the debate with the first question. Okay, just to start, I have one question for Eva and one question for Alexander. The first is for Eva. Which are the greatest risks for the EU financial interest in with regard to German criminal fraud law? And I have another for Alexander, and take notes, Alexander. Just one question. In this moment in the Belgium system, which are the most important risks to EU financial interest? Okay, Eva, if you would like to start to answer, thank you.
Yes, I think there are generally two areas of risks which are both located at the level of the application of the law. First, a big challenge in fraud and also corruption cases is the threshold in fact. In Germany, preliminary proceedings may only be initiated if there is a so-called initial suspicion. And in other words, there must be a sufficient factual basis that a crime has been committed. And however, since in many cases the offender acts in a very organized manner, it is not often possible to cross this threshold. And in this case, the courts, for example, do not issue a search warrant. And of course, this can also become a risk for the EU's financial interest. However, I don't think that this came into play during the corona pandemic. I think the biggest risk here was probably the lack of control before the aids were paid out. And I think another challenge is that the core offense of normal fraud is one of the difficult ones in German criminal fraud law. And on the other side, there is a large number of different case structures which occur. So the practice is therefore dependent on a certain continuity, which is not always guaranteed in view of all these disputes. However, as already indicated, jurisdiction has developed many case groups which are open for new manifestations in fraud. So I would therefore describe German criminal law as very differentiated from substantive law point of view. And currently, I could not identify any real gaps in criminal liability here. And this also applies to the situation in the corona pandemic.
Okay, thank you, Eva. And now I give the floor to Alexander.
Thank you, Alexander, for the interesting question. It's a hard one to tackle, actually, because what are the biggest threats due to the fact that I think the use of cohesion funds for the moment in different regions, definitely because they are allowed to be linked to the COVID-19 pandemic, where normally funds are used to develop regions who have got more difficulties in order to get at the economic level, that's required, but which need to be attained, or which we all want to be attained. Now, within such a COVID-19 pandemic, it might be that it's used for specific commerces or even entrepreneurs with specific issues. And that's something we're looking within Belgium, and definitely in between the regions. Politicians are looking at it, but also I know that the public prosecutors are following this from a very short distance, because that's a major trend that those funds might be abused. Obviously, we don't have at this moment, to my knowledge, a large case of abuse, but I know that they're actually looking at it and that they're following it from very
Okay, thank you, Alexander. I don't know if the other colleagues have another questions for Eva and Alexander. Don't know if I have just another curiosity about okay, Professor Aldo.
I have a question for Eva. You explain us the situation of criminal law in Germany, but do you think there could be an easy cooperation between EPPO and German criminal judges, or do you think there might be difficulties in the collaboration? Thank you.
With regard to the EPPO, or regarding the implementation of a strong awareness of EU's financial interests?
Implementation of frauds.
Okay. Yeah, I think the biggest problem is that in Germany, there is no distinction made between private German and EU funds, because the law does not distinguish either. Fraud is property crime, and the law does not care where the money comes from as far as its elements are fulfilled. And the same applies to criminal procedure law. Here too, no distinction is made with regard to the potential victim. The standards of authority have the same requirements regardless of whether a private person, the Federal Republic of Germany, or the European Union are potential victims. And this is also the reason why the public prosecutors, the police, and in the most cases also the courts do not distinguish between the funds. And to answer the question, I think at the moment, on the basis of our existing law, it's not possible to implement any stronger awareness, because we have to this distinction in the law, and we don't have it. So at the moment, I think on the basis of our existing law, it's not possible to implement any distinction.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eva. I have another question for Alexander, because the new next generation EU funds, it's difficult to manage, and also in a difficult system, the Belgium difficult system. I would like to know if Belgium authority have to implement another mechanism to coordinate the different regions to manage and spend the money well for the next future. And
I understand the question. I think it's a very relevant question. I don't think on an institutional level they need to implement something new, because there is a legislation committee taking care of how those funds can need to be spread out of the different regions depending on the competences they're covering and depending on the territory. Obviously, so on a legal point of view, I think we can come out with it because the negotiation committee takes place with all regional governments and federal government together. And it's also an instrument which is very well institutionalized. The major problem which might appear is just the political problem of dealing with which region gets what. And that's a difficult one, because previously, due to cohesion funds, it was clearly indicated for which region it had the destination, how it was destined. So I guess we will get a lot of political rumors about it, which might lead to growing awareness of the fact that the EU funds and EU funding is an important issue of our country. But on a legal basis, I think institutionally we're ready for it. On a political basis, I've got some doubts.
thank you, Alexander. And I have just another question for Eva for the presentation, about your presentation. How would you assess the overall level of protection of German criminal fraud law?
I would rate the overall level of protection as very high. The criminal liability for fraud has been extended very, very far, especially through the possibility of implied deception and the institute of the damage-like endangerment of assets. I think the problem is more likely lie in the practical area of investigation, because criminals are becoming more and more skilled. They are using technical possibilities, and they are often operating from abroad. And it's becoming increasingly difficult to track them down. What happens most in Germany is that in the most of the biggest cities, special public prosecutors' offices have been developed. So there are not only fraud departments, but also special departments for corruption. And the officials working there are specially trained, and they are well versed in individual criminal behaviors. So for them, it's much easier to adapt for new fraud practices. And this also applies during the Corona pandemic.
Okay, thank you, Eva. Thank you. I don't know if Maciek or other colleague have questions for Alexander and Eva.
So maybe I have only one general remarks after the both presentation. I would like to congratulate my colleagues for the great presentation. And the both presentations show us that the problem of the control of spending EU funds is very interesting and very important for our country. Especially the result of the survey, which was presented by Alexander, show us that it's very important to explain, especially the young people, especially the students, how the mechanism works in practice, which bodies at the national level and the EU level take a care about the financial interest of European Union and national all countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maciek. Thank you. Yes, and I would like to link the remarks from Maciek just for another question for Alexander. We saw that the students is difficult to know the how the students think about the EU. But with these important results of the research, in your opinion, first recommendation to improve the connection from the student with the EU institution, or if you have recommendation about the implementation of the control of the protection of the EU financial interest.
Well, to the extent that I'm able to do it, I think both of them are important. So I think it, when I look at that on a very personal level, and we should always take it into a larger framework when I look how my daughter is taught at school, and I don't say that people are not taking care of it because they're really doing their best, but EU is something abstract where they're not actually brought to the idea that there is something which is governing our lives in a very fundamental matter. It's still linked to national issues and even and to regional issues in Belgium, which might, to the extent that I do know another country, I know that UK that has led to many difficulties with EU elements were never taught in education. And I think it's something important to do, and to that extent to bring it even at a very young age already, make them aware of the importance of the existence of the EU, and then further on, obviously, as it is an important player, it has financial links. I think that's something that can develop later on. Second part of it is that I'm convinced that in a very at a young age of student, which means in the first grades, it might be important. I think it's important to grant them all over the different study objects just some general insight in how the EU works and how the own member states fits into it. Does member states fit into it? But the second element is indeed the implementation itself. I think we should take care, and that's something I would obviously, it's on me to decide. But I think one of the recommendations is also to make aware and to make clear that implementation of EU directives or other EU instruments is done. And that because one of the issues is that the EU prepares in a very, with a lot of transparency on what sides prepares its legislation, but the follow-up of implementation and how it's actually used, also financial means which are granted to certain regions or certain member states, it's not followed up in the same way. I think that's an important element to raise the awareness, not just focusing on the preparation on the rule itself, but also on the application of the rule itself. And I think that's something as obviously it has to come out all over the Betsuko project. It's Betsuko project. It's not only for me to say. I think it might be an important, as a consequence of what we've done in our survey, I think it's an important recommendation to take into account at the end. Potentially, it might be wiped out because it's not supported in the other member states. It's something I would keep in mind as a recommendation at this stage.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Alexander. I have just another question, the last for Eva, because I take notes during the presentation, the post presentation. I just the last for Eva. Could Germany implement a stronger awareness of the EU financial interest in the criminal fraud law, in your opinion?
I think I can do a connection to Aldo's question because it's in the core, it's the same with the answer. So I think if we want to do this, we need a distinction in the legal texts. And as we don't have it at the moment, it's not possible. Maybe you can think about implement a higher protection according to EU's financial interest, but I think we don't need it because German criminal law is very good. I think even if the fraud law is very controversial and complicated, but there is so much literature, there is a very, very differentiated dogmatics. We have a lot of case groups, so the biggest problem is lying in the practice because the criminals are getting better and better, and their proceedings is getting slower and slower. And I think there is a gap between the criminals and the investigative authorities. And I think we should have to look at this gap, and we'll need to try to close this gap. And this is a problem which, according to the German fraud law, and it's all, and not only with regards to the youth financial interests.
Thank you, Eva. Yes, because this is very important. Because when we worked with Alexander and Elisabetta about the case law of Germany, in particular on the case law of the small and medium enterprises, we know that we have the difficulty for Germany to have a good control about the financial aids that provided in the first part of the corona crisis the last year. And I think that this is a point where the Germany system could implement a new and a more efficient law to avoid this, to master the EU financial resources. And also for the VAT is another problem, I think. I don't know if you have another opinion.
Oh, no, not yet.
Okay, thank you. Yes, just another question for Alexander, just the last. And also for the Belgium side, the implementation of the HEPO and the coordination between the national system, the Belgian national system and the HEPO, in your opinion, your country need a more coordination or new norms to implement the future cooperation with the HEPO?
I think we need to the extent we need new laws because Belgian criminal law is pretty organized, so the implementation purely of the recommendations and directives is okay. That's something which has been dealt with and which is still under control under Belgian criminal law. The major issue is the interplay between EPO and Belgian public prosecutors and Belgian courts and tribunals for three reasons. The first reason is the element that there is obviously no, with the information transfer is not perfectly organized. So the collaboration between both has not been worked out legally, which we need perhaps, but obviously we need in practice better collaboration between both. And that brings me to the second element, precisely because Belgian public prosecutors are very often dealing with EU elements, as a lot of EU institutions are actually localized on Belgian territory. So I think that there is still a lack, to the extent that I heard Belgian prosecutors, obviously I haven't spoken to the ones from EPO yet, there is a lack in good transfer of information. And the second element is that in order to bring this into, or to set it up in a good manner, I think we need laws, as Belgian prosecutors have tendency to take care themselves of potential problems within EU institutions. because they consider it part of their territory and part of their will to take care of it within Belgium. And that's perhaps also one of the major issues, because when you look at the EFO, one of the last publication, I think in 2020, Coletto, where they indicated that there has been fraud in Brussels with cheese subsidies, which were provided and which were linked to Bulgaria and to the United Kingdom. Belgium and Belgian prosecutors still consider it to be their own competence, where they have actually to transfer this one to the and that one. And it's linked to the element that they consider their territory. So there is something where we need to nation and good nation into it. And say, from a practical point of view, we need better transfer of information between both units. I hope
Thank you.
An acceptable answer for you.
No, yes, thank you, Alexander. For me, it's good this answer, and I hope that we produce a good recommendation in the last deliverable for this important point. I saw in chat a question for Eva. I don't know if Eva would like to reply now.
I replied in the chat. At the
Okay.
moment, there is nothing to say about that point because I don't know any answer. So
Okay, thank you, Eva. I don't know if the other colleague have questions, or we could finish the section 1 hour and a half of this seminar. Okay, I'm not so.
May I ask one thing, Assembly?
Yes, Alexander.
This is a very practical one, because I noted that I had 2 or 3 typing errors in my presentation. And I just sent you the one without typing errors, and then you can publish that one on the website.
Yes, thank you, Alexander. For the materials, we upload the materials also in the section for the seminar, and also if Eva would like to share with the students the slide, we can upload your slide, Eva, in the section of the seminar, together the flyer and the presentation of Alexander. Or if the Professor Sandulli would like to conclude the seminar. Or,
no, I want just to thank the speakers for great presentations. I think that, it was very interesting, the results of the survey, and also presentation. So thank you very much.